Chinese port scanners flickered once, and America felt it. Before dawn, cargo tagged for United States missile guidance systems was quietly pulled off fast clearance lanes, while civilian shipments sailed through untouched. Bloomberg confirmed the slowdown within hours, and by the time the data reached Washington, Scott Bessent already knew what everyone else refused to say aloud. This wasn't a trade dispute. It was a precision strike on the machinery that powers the United States military. At the same moment, soybean bookings from China collapsed to their lowest level in years, leaving entire farm states exposed. Two pressure points activated at once, with no declaration and no warning. If Beijing pushes 1 inch further, America's supply lines, military and economic, start to choke in real time. Bessent walked into his briefings knowing that China's control over more than 90% of magnet-grade rare earth processing, as Bloomberg noted in its early October coverage, meant that even small shifts in licensing behavior could freeze American supply lines. The past month already delivered evidence. Analysts speaking to Reuters said guidance system suppliers reported new review periods on shipments that previously cleared in hours. That change marked a strategic escalation rather than a commercial dispute, and the agencies tracking it understood that Beijing was signaling selective pressure instead of a general embargo. The pattern tracked with China's broader economic tools, which Financial Times described as calibrated measures used to apply leverage without triggering a full retaliation cycle. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, Chinese regulators drafted licensing rules in the spring that would require detailed disclosures from companies buying or exporting rare earth products, and these requirements were widely interpreted as capable of being adjusted to slow shipments to any target of Beijing's choosing. The United States had prepared to answer with a 100% tariff threat on several categories of Chinese imports, and this created the fragile framework Bessent referenced when he said both sides had reached an initial understanding. Bloomberg reported earlier this month that China was considering delaying its licensing regime for a year, and Bessent treated that delay as a narrow window rather than a durable solution. The risk for Washington became clear from trade data that showed how quickly Chinese regulators could shift volumes. The World Trade Organization's latest goods outlook included figures showing China's expanding control over intermediate mineral exports, particularly those feeding global electronics and defense systems. And this concentration makes what might appear like a temporary slowdown functionally equivalent to a sanctions tool. American defense officials have repeatedly cited rare earths as strategic choke points because the United States processes almost none of the magnets used in its own weapons systems, and the Defense Logistics Agency acknowledged in its annual materials report that several critical minerals remain dependent on Chinese supply chains. Markets began reading these moves as geopolitical signals rather than administrative slowdowns. Reuters added that analysts at multiple research firms warned that China's selective acceleration of non-military shipments indicated the shift was deliberate, not procedural. That interpretation strengthened when cybersecurity researchers told Financial Times that certain Chinese data security companies had identified software vulnerabilities later linked to exploitation techniques used by state-backed groups. The combined effect, magnet pressure, data access concerns, and licensing delays, created a convergence Washington had been hoping to avoid. The United States had attempted to stabilize agricultural trade at the same time, relying on Chinese purchases of soybeans to support American farmers facing weak margins and volatile global prices. USDA export data showed that China remained the largest buyer of American soybeans for most of the past decade, and the stability of those purchases supported rural economies across the Midwest. But official data this year revealed a sharp reversal. In April, China imported roughly 1.38 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans, a drop of more than 40% from the same month a year prior, as reported by USDA weekly trade summaries and analyzed by Reuters. Bloomberg also noted that China accumulated large domestic reserves, giving Beijing flexibility to delay U.S. purchases without risking domestic shortages. The scale of these reserves, according to projections cited by Financial Times, could reach more than a third of the world's soybean stockpile by the end of 2025. That number altered the balance of power, because China could now use timing rather than tariffs to exert pressure. Meanwhile, Chinese buyers booked more than 7 million metric tons of Brazilian and Argentinian soybeans in a recent month, according to S&P Global Commodity Insights, and these shipments flowed at prices more competitive than those from the United States. The lingering 13% tariff on American soybeans, even after China suspended some retaliatory duties, preserved a meaningful price gap that favored South America. The United States publicly stated that China agreed to buy 12 million tons of American soybeans by January and 25 million tons per year for the next 3 years. But neither Beijing nor China's import agencies confirmed these figures. Analysts told Reuters that actual purchases could be far lower, with some forecasts indicating that China might buy less than 9 million tons during the 2025 to 2026 cycle. The gap between stated commitments and observed bookings created uncertainty that Bessent could not ignore, and his repeated caution in recent interviews reflected the possibility that China was using soybean timing as an additional negotiating lever. American farm groups understood the significance. USDA economic briefs observed that soybean revenue underpins thousands of rural communities, and any prolonged delay in Chinese buying could cut household income across regions already stressed by high equipment costs and variable weather patterns. These communities rely on futures markets that react sharply to shifts in China's buying cycles, and recent volatility has forced grain elevators and cooperatives to adjust storage plans at short notice. The impact cascades through fertilizer suppliers, transport networks, and credit lines linked to seasonal crop cycles. Supply chains outside agriculture were strained simultaneously. New U.S. tariffs on a broad range of Chinese imports led to marked reductions in cargo volumes leaving major Chinese ports, according to shipping trackers cited by Bloomberg. Container availability dropped sharply on several routes to the West Coast, and retailers began warning of potential shortages of electronics, toys, appliances, and holiday goods. Reuters reported that many retailers held back seasonal orders because freight rates surged and tariff unpredictability made inventory planning hazardous. Some firms that relied heavily on low-value imports under the previous duty-free threshold faced new costs that narrowed margins to break-even levels. Holiday inventories became a leading concern. Several industry surveys showed fewer than half of major retailers had fully restarted seasonal shipping commitments, leaving them exposed if demand spikes during the final quarter. Walmart said in its most recent earnings call that higher import tariffs were already increasing costs on non-food categories sourced from China, and these increases would reach consumers. Financial Times detailed cases where small import-dependent businesses faced dramatic expense jumps, including one home goods retailer confronting a seven-figure customs bill due to containers delayed under the new tariff rules. All of these pressures fed the same strategic picture: rare earths, soybeans, holiday goods, and technical vulnerabilities converged into a single moment in which Chinese regulatory choices could influence the American economy far beyond any single sector. IMF commodity tables show how concentrated mineral processing has become, and rare earth magnets represent one of the most extreme examples. This asymmetry explains why Bessent emphasized structural reforms rather than short-term agreements. Reuters quoted several U.S. officials calling for expanded domestic processing capacity and new investment in allied supply chains spanning Australia, Canada, and several African nations with undeveloped deposits. Financial Times also noted that Japan and South Korea invested heavily in non-Chinese mineral processing through 2024 and 2025, recognizing the vulnerability that comes from relying on a single source. These moves align with broader diversification trends tracked by the WTO, which found that multiple economies are attempting to shift critical supply chains even as China remains dominant. But such transitions take years, and the United States cannot replace Chinese capacity quickly enough to avoid short-term disruptions if licensing slows again. The fragility of the current framework became clearer as Chinese officials offered limited public comment. Bloomberg observed that Beijing had not issued formal statements confirming purchase commitments or licensing delays, instead signaling flexibility through regulatory notices that could be revised with little warning. This created an environment in which any diplomatic tension or economic shift could alter enforcement timelines. U.S. strategists recognize that such uncertainty itself functions as leverage because American industries cannot plan long-term production when export approvals might tighten without explanation. Energy markets added another layer of uncertainty. Reuters reported that several state-linked Chinese firms increased procurement of critical battery minerals to secure long-duration storage capabilities for new energy systems, and this increased competition risks, diverting magnet-linked capacity even further from U.S. buyers. The Pentagon's own industrial base reviews highlighted the vulnerability of electric vehicle supply chains that rely on rare earth magnets, and American automakers warned that any export disruption could block timelines for upcoming models. Within this context, soybean delays appeared even more strategic. China could support domestic feedstock needs using its reserves while waiting to see how U.S. tariff policy evolves. S&P Global said this gave Beijing room to push back against Washington's expectations without triggering domestic inflation or supply risks. Farm state lawmakers, watching these trends, pressed for immediate expansion of export credit programs and federal support mechanisms in case Chinese purchases fall short. The United States, meanwhile, continued pressing allies to coordinate rare earth strategies. Financial Times reported that several European automakers sought long-term agreements with non-Chinese suppliers, though these suppliers operate on far smaller scales than firms in Inner Mongolia or Sichuan. Australia's Lynas Rare Earths remains one of the few large non-Chinese processors, and its capacity is limited compared to Chinese giants like China Northern Rare Earth Group. This mismatch shows why United States planning documents repeatedly call for multi-year investment rather than expecting rapid shifts in supply. The convergence of holiday shortages, agricultural uncertainty, and defense sector vulnerability pushed American analysts to treat the rare earth delay as a temporary ceasefire rather than a break in the underlying trend. Reuters wrote that any resumption of licensing controls early next year could hit United States factories and defense contractors before replacement supply chains mature. That risk looms over every forecast for early 2026, especially as global shipping faces bottlenecks from conflicts near key maritime routes. By mid-autumn, container prices on some Asia to United States lanes had doubled, according to Bloomberg freight indexes, and this created additional pressure on companies already dealing with tariff volatility. Several major firms began exploring Mexico-based manufacturing as a buffer, leveraging near-shoring trends encouraged by existing North American agreements. But these transitions take time, capital, and logistical rewiring. The question building over all this is whether China intends to let the current delay hold, or whether the pause merely provides time to adjust internal priorities before applying pressure again. The licensing regime remains the decisive lever, and officials tracking it believe it can be tightened in ways that appear procedural but function strategically. Washington's reliance on promised soybean purchases adds a second vulnerability because missed deadlines can destabilize an entire sector already under strain. The trajectory now hinges on whether Beijing finds advantage in letting shipments flow or in demonstrating how quickly it can close a valve. With every week of silence from Chinese regulators, that calculation becomes harder to read. The framework survives only as long as it serves both sides, and geopolitical frameworks rarely stay still for long. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.